for joining us for a very interesting session with my esteemed panelists, discussing an interesting topic on combating the cyber security risk and vulnerabilities in the interconnected world. So, Kimi, let me start with and share some perspective around. So, India is on a journey of driving creation of some innovative digital enterprises and obviously driving digital transformation across the industries. We are the, the fastest growing economies and we are aspiring to be the third largest over the next few years by 2030. We are the largest or one of the largest consumer markets in the world. So this is certainly opening up a plethora of opportunities for all of us and providing opportunities to innovate and driving newer services, putting up mechanisms for better customer experience. Having said that, it is also imposing us or exposing us to some of the challenges and complexities of the world. Further, there are a few trends that we are observing. One, and this is specifically post-COVID that we have seen, that there is increase in acceptance to some of the adoption of some of the emerging technologies. So that's one good thing that we are seeing. Second is the world is getting more and more interconnected and the supply chains are becoming more global. And third, there is an increase in size and complexity of the partner ecosystem that the organizations are operating with globally. So while this is providing opportunities, as I said, to innovate some of our services, bringing in global perspective, global experience to our customers, but it is also exposing us to some of the complexities and challenges of monitoring and managing the services and products across the supply chain, right? And this is basically is very critical to ensure a smooth operations. So there is a need to put up what we are calling as digital supply chain. Now, what is a digital supply chain? Digital supply chain is not a software product. It's more kind of a concept and a strategy which has been fueled by some of the emerging technologies. And these technologies includes artificial intelligence, IoTs, blockchains, enabled with some of the capabilities around data and analytics. There's huge amount of data that all of the organizations have, and these technologies are enabling us to drive efficiencies by putting up automations across the supply chain, right? Automating some of the critical aspects of supply chain in terms of the demand forecasting, inventory management, and logistics planning, and so on and so forth, right? So while digital supply chain is coming up as a boon in terms of helping up enhance the overall efficiencies of the business and driving growth, this is also becoming kind of a single point of failure. And this is exposed to some of the emerging cybersecurity risk and vulnerabilities. And it requires mechanisms to adequately secure and protect the digital supply chain. So during the discussion today with our panelists, we'll try to discuss some of the key aspects of what are the risks and vulnerabilities that the entire digital supply chain is getting exposed to. How should we be distributing roles and responsibilities across the partner ecosystem when we are operating in a global landscape? Some of the contractual considerations that we should keep in mind when we are entering into the global partner ecosystem. And another important aspect we will touch upon, well, I think we are all pretty well aware of looking at the supply chain across various types of services and products. But software supply chain is becoming an increasingly complex concept these days. So we would also like to touch base upon what are the mechanisms to secure the software, the supply chain. So with that, maybe let me turn over to you, Yusuf, and maybe start taking your views in terms of how supply chain is getting digitally transformed, and what are the key drivers that you see which business are basically looking at and getting benefited from transforming the supply chain more on the digital platforms.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. See, the way the business is growing now through the advancement of digital transformation, which means that you have to build those capabilities, right? And of course, largely you have to rely on your third-party suppliers to build those capabilities, right? And of course, when somebody is building capabilities and you adopt into your organization, right? So you would be coming along a lot of risk, a lot of transfer of data in between they have to understand. And since we are talking about digital, so there are a lot of transaction which happens between the parent company and the suppliers, right? Whether you are actually processing a data or in a typical contact center, right? They have almost like all information of my business processes, right? So literally they are aware what we have, they have ready in with their information. So I think visibility factor is so important to understand who all your suppliers are, right? So the IT, security, and the supply chain team has to work very closely. Usually that visibility is not being showcased because you have so many suppliers within an organization, you don't know who has access, who will be accessing what IT systems, right? So that visibility is so very important to know who all your suppliers are, right? Once you know them, and very closely you have to work with the supply chain. Supply chain plays a major role because they have to tell us. We don't have that inventory. We don't have that database, who all our suppliers, what information, what services they are providing, what products they are providing. Using those products, what data would be transferred or used in this transaction. So that visibility is so very important to know that who are suppliers. And of course, you have solutions available to ensure that you are monitoring your suppliers. So both ways you have advantages in the current state of affairs. You know your suppliers and you know what are the systems that are needed to monitor because we are talking about data, right? So which is most essential aspect of any business, right? So the visibility is so very important to build and then keep on monitoring between the suppliers, whether he is a software supplier or any other hardware supplier or any kind of services, a partner, a consultant, advisor. So much of data will get transacted, right? So we need to ensure that visibility factor is being actually maintained. Very important.
Yes, on that note, I think consultants anyhow get sufficient visibility, so I think you're safe on that part. But I think that while you touch base on the points of, because you are working in, again, a partner ecosystem, there's a lot of information which is getting shared all across, and we'll come to the point of how do you minimize that information, because currently the trend that we are seeing that you're sharing the information beyond the purpose which might be needed by the third party. And you raised a very valid point that visibility of the third party in the supplier itself is a challenge, right? So I'll not name, but I was working with one of the organizations, and the entire activity is to do the supplier discovery, to realize that there are more than 4,000 plus service providers to the organization. So that's an important part. But coming back to the entire concept of digital supply chain, and Neha, maybe let's turn back to you, because when you're talking about the challenges of digital supply chain, one of the observation that we have is that you're operationally getting more digitized and relying upon the digital supply chain. And that's where the resilience of it is becoming really important, right? So what are the challenges, Neha, if I may ask you, in terms of managing some of those challenges of digital supply chain and ensuring the right amount of resilience is built, and how do we do that?
So adding on to the point which Yusuf made about visibility, so second step from there, even if we have visibility of supplier ecosystem, we do not have direct visibility of the information and cybersecurity posture which these suppliers would have at their end. So again, that lack of visibility compounded with the data protection part of it. The onus lies on the entity which is which is consuming customer data, which is providing services to protect data from each of the partners in the supplier ecosystem. So one of the major challenges other than visibility is also enforcing a similar security posture throughout your entire ecosystem. When you don't even have this visibility, how do you go about enforcing that similar security posture? The other thing is, if you look at it, the security posture enforcement from your end, each supplier may not be equipped to entail that amount of investment which is required to get to that particular posture. And Another challenge which comes to my mind as one of the major challenges, in fact, we would have heard of colonial pipeline attack, a cyber attack on the supply chain. It can compromise everything to the extent that there are multiple ramifications, be it in terms of reputation loss, be it in terms of availability. There are multiple angles to it. So now the supply chain related cyber attacks are growing tremendously in numbers. And if you look at it, software supply chain is one such category. So considering that, tying this all, when you have your suppliers, the way you're connected to them, the kind of information you are sharing with them, and the investment they are ready to entail with you to make you compliant overall, I think are the key points which need attention if this has to work together as a protected ecosystem.
Sure, thank you, Neha. So while we move to our next question, we have our fourth panelist, Mr. Baidyanath Kumar. He's the CISO for JK Cement. May I please request him to join us? Okay, so just drawing the clue from what you mentioned, Neha, the one is obviously the visibility point, and second is, and we'll touch base separately, that it is also important to define what are the type of services that you're providing, right? Because the security considerations and challenges would vary basis that. But if I look at all these challenges that you mentioned, Yusuf and Neha, in terms of the visibility of it and how do you ensure the right amount of data being shared and is used for the right purpose. So if I could just ask you, Debasish, that when you are digitizing the entire supply chain and you're transforming it, what are some of the key security considerations that you should keep into perspective? And particularly when you are talking about the entire diversified partner ecosystem.
That's a great point, and thank you for asking that, Nitin. So as we live in a more interconnected ecosystem, and as some of my co-panelists have already tried to bring the point home, that it's no more a siloed ecosystem. Business works with multiple third parties. And across the IT, and if I extend it further into the operational technology ecosystem, the relevance of supply chain management and bringing in secure supply chain management as a perspective is absolutely important. To that point, there are multiple critical considerations, and I take a 9-prong rule of thumb, and if I can summarize it in a one word, it could be pastings. So P would stand for physical security, A for application security, S wherein I could be able to secure the endpoints. T is I have to keep an eye on the evolving threat landscape and the threat intelligence. I, no matter what I do, I would living in a fool's world if I were to believe that I would not be attacked, right? So if in case an incident happens, so I would be, do I have an incident management system which is robust enough? Now with all that in mind, N would stand for network security. So I need to keep an eye on the network piece of it. And then G is, do I have a strong governance mechanism to integrate all these aspects? And finally, S would be a very strong and robust security operating center. So if I take PASTINGS, it gives me a framework to address some of these key considerations wherein I can actually, irrespective of the scale of the enterprise that I work with, probably have rightly positioned to address the security ecosystem in this interconnected enterprise that we're talking about. So that gives me a benchmark or a platform to start assessing, measuring, and monitoring my entire third-party life cycle per se, and then gives me the confidence and an assurance to the board that yes, we would be able to secure the enterprise as a whole, as well as the entire supply chain ecosystem that comes with it, right?
That's very interesting and a bit embarrassing also. I thought I'm in the profession where I can only do these acronyms and abbreviations, but the farthest I've gone is 4 letters. I think this is like 7, 8 letters, but I can't accept it, I have to contribute to it. So I can elaborate a bit on the governance part, and I think this is what Neha, you also mentioned. Typically what we have seen when we are looking at governance specifically on the supply chain contracts, we are only looking at managing the security aspects of the services that the supplier is providing, services or the product or whatever that the supplier is providing. We generally miss the point that how secure the supplier is as an organization, right? And that also becomes really critical because, as I said, resilient is a key. So while the services being provided are secured, but not from a secured environment, that obviously is a challenge. So that should be something more to be looked at when we are looking at the overall governance. But while we are looking at it, and I think this is what I want to move to you, but then another thing, there's a large complex partner ecosystem. So when you talk about the supplier ecosystem, the partner ecosystem, it's pretty complex. And there's an increasing requirement from the compliance and regulatory as well, particularly the point which Neha touched upon of the flow of data, right? And also when you're looking at the services, particularly I can talk for the telecom space, there is a transfer of compliances to the service provider as well, right? So what are some of the leading practices that you would like to share with us in terms of managing security while putting up the contracts with other parties or service providers?
So, yeah, very pertinent question. If you see in modern threat landscape, the diversified ecosystem where we are having a big supply chain mechanism, particularly if you talk about the manufacturing sector also, right? So even the way we are adopting a digital transformation journey, a lot of new innovative ideas in terms of adopting to low code, no code platforms or whatever in the manufacturing processes, right? So it is very important to understand that how your secure partner ecosystem should be. So it starts with the due diligence process itself. So when we talk about that, so let's have a complete understanding what are their requirements when we talk about the cybersecurity aspects. Even the way regulatory landscape is changing, right? Even in India also. We have to understand that how much compliance standards and all those things they are also following. For example, if we talk about supplier processing a data, right? For example, PII data in cloud. So for that, for them, when we talk about it is mandatory to have ISO 27018 certification. It's not about only 27001, right? So those all important things what you are going to evaluate, right? You need to understand that also what are their requirement in terms of cybersecurity aspects. The second foremost important is to understand the complete risk management ecosystem of the partner. So when you are going to understand that, so then only you can have a complete control on the supply chain requirements. So when we talk about even are we having some sort of predictive analysis in stock management or demand forecasting. So those things are very important to understand. So risk management is one of the key component when we talk about the third party risk management. So it has to be started with even classifying your suppliers as critical and non-critical suppliers. Because if you are not able to classify them, you will be ending up to not have a good governance where the audit related requirements, it has to be stringent when we talk about the critical suppliers. For example, if you are opting for a co-location services in terms of hosting your data centric components and all those things. So there lies your, if you talk about the criticality, it is more severe. So are you going to define a different set of audit mechanism? Might be a lot of services we are adopting like in terms of marketing or in terms of services like AC fans and all those things for organizations. So though for them, audit part is not required. But when we talk about classifying the vendors or suppliers and then doing the thorough audit to understand that are they meeting all those requirements. So while developing the contract itself, those all audit related requirements should be mentioned clearly. And it has to be there a legal counsel view also. So for example, if there are some sort of GTB, what we call general terms and conditions, right? So when we are reviewing that also, is that legally vetted properly? for all the supplier and ecosystem. So this is the important point. The next important point is to have a clear communication, right? Communication in terms of flexibility requirements and all those things, because the way regulations and regulatory requirements are changing, we need to understand that are there anything which comes up and they are able to adapt to that. Okay, so these are very important when we are talking about the partner ecosystem. And finally, while developing the contract itself, you have to understand what are the roles and responsibilities in the shared model. For example, in cloud service adoption, if you see, when we are going to have some sort of IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS adoption also, right? So then also, if you see, always in sort of SaaS model, when we talk about, most of the responsibilities for security also lies with your third party. For example, we have Salesforce adoption or Oracle Transport Management for logistics, supply chain, and all those things. So you need to understand that what is your roles and responsibilities and what is the roles and responsibilities which lies at the supplier side. So those all classifications has to be clearly defined, and that had to be regulated. That has to be regulated. These are the important ones.
Great. I think very, very interesting point. So if I just get this right and just summarize the two important aspects that you mentioned. One is classifying basis the criticality, and second is obviously basis the type of service. Because one other important aspect we need to keep into consideration, anything that we are putting up into the contract, obviously I think there are a lot of procurement folks also, I believe, they are in the room. So there's a direct linkage to the cost, right? Because there's nothing, no compliance comes for free. So I remember, Yusuf, you were mentioning some parts on the tiering of service providers, because it's also important to assess not only the criticality, but the type of service. It might be a service or a product in terms of the software and all those things. So how do you perform that tiering and accordingly define those contractual obligations?
Yeah, I think just to what extent what Baidyanath was saying, the classification aspect is important. Because if you don't know your suppliers, then it's going to be very difficult to control them. And you're not controlling the supplier, you're controlling the access of the data between the suppliers. So, and what strategy? Because you have to create a strategy in order to take your entire supply chain ecosystem in a controlled fashion, right? So you need to know who are your suppliers and what kind of information that has been shared between the supplier and what access that they have. So, for example, data center, right? Data center is the biggest example of being a tier 1 supplier, because what they are holding my data, right? 24/7. If anything goes wrong with the data center, there's an earthquake, how are we going to recover? Do we have the necessary resilience being built in this entire supply chain, right? So that's how tiering of the supply chain is so important. You tire your supplier based on the sensitivity of and the access of the data that they have, right? If I'm a support partner, I'm providing IT support to my organization from their location, from a different location than my premise, which means that there's lack of visibility of who is coming to the ODCs, where they're supporting us, what kind of access, do they have all the relevant controls built in place, what we expect because they are accessing our data, right? So that's how you create multiple layers and categories of suppliers. Based on that, you define what level of controls that you want to build in, monitoring. So if I am running a data center, I would definitely like to audit the data center at least a quarter, right? To make sure that all the security, physical security, resilience, all the controls are in place or not, right? And a supplier which has access to my data supporting us, I can do it once in a year or not, right? So the suppliers who have access to the data, but that is not sensitive, but still we wanted to know that what kind of controls there, and I will do a survey. I will do a security assessment. I'll supply them a questionnaire. They will respond back with the evidences and the support to claim that there certain controls are in place. I will do it. So that's how you tire and do the assessment. and run your governance control into those suppliers. Very important is that first you know what suppliers are, because that's the biggest challenge that we face. Any of the organization is to know that, because you have local suppliers, you have a company which is spread across geolocation, you need to know what kind of regulations are there in that geolocation, right? And you are accountable. Ultimately, you are accountable as a parent organization, not your suppliers, which means that the liability, right, indemnity clause has to be there. If anything goes wrong, at least as a compensating control, you are able to protect your interest, right? So the contract plays a major role, right? All of these terms and conditions have to be part of the contract. A standard contract for various tiers of the suppliers need to be created by the organization in order to actually address specific. So one general term doesn't work. It is very specific terms, specific type of suppliers, specific tiers of suppliers. You need to do the assessment and then ensure that overall governance are in place.
This is really helpful, Yusuf, and I think you made a very important point saying that eventually it is our accountability. So typically what I've seen that when we put all these considerations into a contract, we assume that this is the supplier's accountability, and obviously if they're not complying, there will be SLAs and there will be reward and penalties and various mechanisms which are like more commercial mechanisms. But I don't think I have seen any contract in my life where I think the penalties are put up to a tune to basically manage the complete potential loss that the organization may have with any such kind of cyber breaches. So that's important, and I think, Vaidyan, as you raised a point in terms of the assessment part, and I just want to add to that.
Yeah, just one point to that. Because rightly even explained by Yusuf to what I pointed. Termination of clause is also very important, right? Completely the contract itself, when we are talking about, so either it is exit related things or the termination of clause in terms of anything where the non-compliance is there. For example, if for a data center audit, a TR 942 certification is required, right? That has to be mandatorily there. So related to a structural building certificate and all those, whatever soil test, seismic zone related certification requirements, there are a lot of standards they need to follow. If something is not being followed, after audits and audits, right? Because you need to define the audit frequency also. Rightly pointed that, for example, if it is a critical supplier, like data center, it has to be quarterly or half yearly. You should not be betting for that ISO 27001 audit has to happen in the next year, then I will be doing some sort of audit before that, right? As an internal audit, you have to do your assessment based on your checklist, and you have to complete understanding of what are the data center, are they following the ASRE guidelines completely, right? Which is important for a tier 3 or tier 4 data centers. So if those things are there as per the checks and balances, so you are on top of that, you are monitoring the even compliance from their perspective on time and getting the things regulated.
No, I completely agree, and the point that you raised, that I think some of these requirements, compliance requirements, will touch base on that, and this is again one of the suggestions that we may keep into consideration. See, typically when we put these compliant obligations on the contracts, and you should also mention on the tiering part, it needs to be aligned with the tiering of the service provider and the kind of service that you're providing. Because what is happening typically, we just put up all these compliance requirements, assuming that we are transferring the accountability, which never gets transferred, right? You will always remain accountable. This unnecessary increasing and putting up maybe more kind of a pressure on the commercial that you are getting into. So that is really important. And second aspect, when you're talking about the assessments, I think typically we always ask that, okay, the organization needs to be ISO 27001 certified, or it should have the ISAE attestation and all those things. It is also important to know that where all we need it. Do you really need it? I think some of the low critical, I think many of the times I've seen, we find every service is critical, but that's not the case, right? So for the services which are less critical, it's also okay to put up a self-assessment as one of the consideration, but it's important that we leverage on that particular aspect of the contract. So that's important, and thanks for sharing your views around that. I'll just touch base on the other part, and for that maybe I'll come to you, Debasish. See, while we are talking about all these contracts, we'll be looking at the services, we are looking at the software procurement part, right? We are largely looking at the IT products, which are still reasonably standardized. the partner and the ISVs are reasonably flexible around that. But when it comes to OT part of it, this is one area which is still evolving. So what are some of the considerations when you're looking at securing the procurement of OT systems, and we're talking about the OT security?
Yeah, I think taking a leaf from what exactly both of my co-panelists, Yusuf and Baidyanath, mentioned and rightly summarized by you, it's no more, see, the myth in the business world is that once you sign a contract and you have maybe done it the ideal way, but there is a transaction cost involved anyways, so you cut short something here and there. But the myth is that you tend to believe that the supplier is responsible, accountable for something going wrong. With growing regulation and almost across the industries that you see more of in manufacturing, and it has triggered by something which was started as a software bill of material act which the US enacted in Biden's era, and then usually what US does is followed by Europe and then comes to APAC and India as well. And that takes care of the software part of it. What essentially you want to say is that not just believe on the COTS products. You know, when an incident happens, you should not be struggling to find out where is the root problem, right? So like in a manufacturing world, people would realize that, you know, you would have a bill of material for everything, right? And software essentially used to come as a package and you would not know. And many of these attacks that have happened across the manufacturing world on OT systems probably started, and the source of that could be a small piece of code which was there and was vulnerable and hijacked, and then lateral movement happened and cross-network segmentation was not there. They got into OT systems and systems were impacted. So the problem is that in the OT system is even more complex because you have lives involved, you have health and safety considerations. So that's a little complex. The way you attack OT security is quite different from the way you would handle IT security. I believe most of my panelists would agree to that. So while we, as you rightly said, IT security is something which is quite stable. Second, I am heavily dependent on an OEM player. So I have the big OEMs of the world, all of you would know, no need to name them, but they would have their proprietary protocols running in most of the cases, and then there is a complexity in terms of how would I monitor them. So even if I have visibility to the asset landscape, entire OT ecosystem, if I'm able to discover is number one challenge. Second is even if I'm able to discover, are those protocol compliant to the IT systems that are required to monitor them? So these are few things which is a critical, I would say, a roadblocker for most of the IT systems, OT security considerations. But there are ways to start small, and the best way to start is to follow some of these standards. So there are standards like IEC 62443, there are NIST protocols which you can start with, which gives you a baseline to conduct an assessment across various parameters of the OT system. So you conduct various assessments, start with an assessment, understand the visibility, have a strategy, start small, and then probably do a POC to realize that whether that solution that you want to put in is scalable to your large ecosystem or not. And then put up a robust strategy based on the foundings of the POC, internalize it, understand best practices and govern. So that's the way forward which I personally have seen has worked for many of the manufacturing companies I've worked with. But that's the way forward in which we have to think progressively to start small and then scale through a robust strategy.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. I know there's a lot more to discuss. We're running short of time. So I have two more questions, but before I go on to that, which is exactly what I was doing. So if there are any questions from the audience, I think we would like to take those first. Otherwise, I have just one more aspect to cover with Neha. Okay, it might be the time of the day or the subject, I really don't know. But yeah, so maybe then I have one question for you, Neha, and I think this is pretty a hot topic of discussion with this DPDPA. This is a new act which has come in. And I think at the start of the discussion, we shared a lot of transfer of information or data sharing which is happening across the partner ecosystem. And the act has put in a lot of, I would say, consideration, maybe you can still do that. So I'm not getting into the cross-border transfer, but I'm saying when you're sharing that information with the partner ecosystem, what are the considerations that you need to keep into mind? and maybe some of those aspects that you may have to cover while putting up the contract. So that could be one of the other criteria to tier your service providers with kind of sharing of the personal information.
So even if like the standard contractual clauses are in place with respect to right to audit and all, the data privacy aspect is over and above the standard contractual clauses you would have in place. So 2-3 key points which I feel will change the nature of contracting. So Data Privacy Act specifically calls out that the consent is obtained from customers in a defined format of the notice. Now, when you are using customer data for analytics, you are sharing it with your third parties, and the customers may not be aware of that. So that is one nuance you have to bake in while informing the customer in the notification process itself. The second nuance, other than contractual clauses, is the thought around what if the customer withdraws the consent. Defining a process around that, if the consent is withdrawn at your end, it is your supplier ecosystem also where the consent is withdrawn, it's applicable to them as well. So how do you ensure that that particular consent withdrawal process is kind of the suppliers also fall into place for that, implementing that. And last but not the least, there is a concept around that particular data breach notification process you define for your organization. The templates, the incident reporting process, whatever you define, how do you ensure that your suppliers also follow a similar process? And if, God forbid, and I think rightly pointed out, attacks would always be there. So if there is a breach at the supplier ecosystem end, because of their lack of notification to you, you breach your own timelines, and there are severe penalties around these kind of breaches. So I think these are some of the key nuances, while a lot of, again, you will have to follow data privacy governance framework. Those are the standard things, but these, especially the consent withdrawal part of it, seems like a tricky proposition for now, considering we are, again, saying that we do not have visibility of the entire supplier ecosystem.
I can't agree more with you, Neha. I think this is really complex. We're just praying that the government will be slightly more kind when they come out with the rules. So yeah, please.
And just one point to what Neha mentioned, because even consent management platform is going to solve the problem, but if you see, it is clearly mentioned that it has to be developed in 22 different languages, right, as per the 8th constitution model, right? So how it is going to, it is going to be tricky. Somewhere someone is going to refute that you have created your platform in English language, but I am not able to I was not able to understand at that point, and I had consented, but I am not okay with that consent. So then how you are going to, if you are going to develop that platform also, you have to develop in all those 22 languages.
No, absolutely.
That is going to be a
biggest challenge. This is a
platform.
complex subject altogether. But I think just to reduce some complexity from the contracting process particularly, when you are putting up a contract with a third party where you are sharing your personal information, I think there are certain considerations. So it is important for us to define the data set that we are sharing with the third party contractually. We restrict the purpose of processing by the third party in the contract with respect to the services that they are doing. And consent management contractually is easy to solve, but operationally is not an easy thing to solve. So as Neha, you mentioned, if someone withdraws the consent, you need to also ensure that the data processors also remove that. And yeah, that's something which will gonna evolve. But thank you very much. Thank you all for sharing your input. I think this is really helpful. And this is helpful for me because I think we have established not an easy problem to solve. So you need consultants like me. Just let me know, and I'll be happy to help you out. But thank you very much. Thanks all of you, and looking forward to connect with you separately. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.